Swagatam. You are all welcome to this talk, which is entitled Value Education, Yes, but through what texts? So the talk is that value education is a very good idea. We need values, but how it is to be imparted and what are the texts where the values are enshrined which we would like to follow, the values which we would like to teach. So I begin with the Mangalacharana. Yastanmayad hridaya samvadanakramena drakchitra shakti gana bhumi vibhaga bhagi harshollasat paravikara jushah karoti vande tamam tamahamindu kalavatamsam. For a long time in India, we have had this debate. And this debate becomes very acute when there is a change in the government from left to right, from the usual Congress, secular government to the right or the rightist, right of the center BJP government. The debate becomes very acute, and not because in the Nehruvian order, not because there were no values in the Nehruvian order. Obviously there were values. Obviously values were being stated, propagated, enforced, even the constitution being amended as it was by Indira Gandhi to put in the word socialist secular state. So we had a statement and an enforcement of certain values, certain principles, political, cultural, and maybe obliquely about the metaphysical nature of the world. So there was a value system. Then on the other side, we have a value system which should be followed, as the new dispensation would like to say. But that value system would be just called teaching of values or value education. The Congress party did all kinds of changes. It promoted all kinds of ideas, but never called them values. And when we had the change in government, then there was the talk of values. Although the constitution remains the same, the political order pretty much remains the same, nobody is challenging democracy, nobody is wanting any big change in the legal or education system. So what is this then value? First, let me get to the idea of how does this idea of value education come into circulation. As far as I can make out, it seems to me to be a refurbishing of the earlier concept of moral education. In my childhood, in my young days in college, there used to be a morality class, and we were taught on moral issues. We were asked to talk about moral issues or issues which threaten morality. So I was asked to give a talk on moral issues in my first year in college in the morality class. And when I chose the subject of sex, I said, sir, I'll talk on sex. The principal of my good Christian college was scandalized. But all the same, he was a very liberal person, kind-hearted teacher. He said, yes, let's see what you have to say. And I read a lot of Freud and Erich Fromm and all the modern psychologists and talked about sexual morality. The lecture was a success. He thought I never said anything dangerous, and so the class was considered good, and it sufficiently, came up to the standard of moral teaching. But mostly in that session, we had these sort of semi-sermons which somehow reflected the idea of the Good Samaritan, or the idea of bearing the burden of somebody else's suffering, although it could be a jatak also, for the sake of a secular education. It could be from somewhere else in the Hindu mythology. But most of these ideas, they centered around either love or suffering for the sake of somebody else. And this is in the 60s, and this was in a Christian institution. And I was told by several other people, because there is not much record of these things, that most of the moral education was about being good, but being good in a Christian way. So the idea of moral education came into the Indian education with the British, which was a soft way of peddling Christianity. You know that after a while the British thought that full-scale efforts at conversion would create too many problems, particularly after 1857 War of Independence. They thought that it would not be such a good idea to let the missionaries loose on the ground. So they considered that it would be better to present fundamental Christian values, ideas or values in moral education. I think in the last 20-30 years, we have started looking upon the same idea, the same notion of value education or moral education in order to usher in ideas from Hindu texts. Now, certainly ushering good ideas from Hindu text or Christian text or Islamic text is in itself a very worthy aim. But the question is that when you go about this thing, then what do you do actually? You know what some of the modern pharmaceutical companies of the allopathic medicine are doing? They are trying to isolate that particular chemical formulae or composition in an Ayurvedic medicine which works, and then you make a drug, you give it a name according to the Western marketing strategy, and you sell it. So it is like taking the essence or taking the essential factor, packaging it, repackaging it and selling it. But anybody who knows Ayurveda knows that it will never work. It's never possible to, first of all, isolate the essential chemical or chemical combination, administer it as a aushadhi or as a medicine, and provide relief. It's the whole medicine which is to be given, the whole vanaspati, and in the prescribed way and in the method which has been followed. Then only it works. Now, carrying this illustration or drishtanta forward in the context of value education, if these values are extracted from certain texts, then instead of teaching this extract, why not teach the texts themselves? Why not teach the texts themselves? If values are enshrined in those texts, if certain ideas are taken from those texts, then why not teach those texts? That is the real question. When people talk about value education, I am all for it and I admire their purpose. But then I question that, can you really do it? Because what happens is that the real message of the traditional texts, whether it is the Puranas or the Mahakavyas or the Vedic mantras or karikas of different shastras, or stories, very simple stories, jatakas, or the entertainment stories but educative, falling in the niti category, like Panchatantra or Shuk Saptati. All these things, when they are reduced to certain maxims, certain extracts are taken out of them, and when those things are prescribed, then it just becomes a medicine. It becomes an obligation. And therefore, value education just becomes another kind of a neo-catechism. You know, the Christian catechism. So, value education again becomes that catechism. And that is the general tendency that comes under the category of something like commandmentalizing Hinduism, that you want that it should be reduced to a certain set of precepts, commands, and all this follows the Christian mimetic. It falls in that category. To my mind, that is the tendency that we tend to follow. And in the education system, it becomes more and more of a burden on the student instead of a pleasure. Because then the teacher would have to teach a book of morality, or a book of certain good maxims, or that these ideas would be fitted into somewhere, into, let's say, sociology or civics or history, and they would create a dissonance. And then of course would follow all kinds of controversies about tempering with the textbooks, etc., etc. I think we need a more simple, honest, and straightforward strategy. We have to say that, look, in the British period, we had a certain kind of education. In the Nehruvian period, after independence, we had a follow-up on that. We had the socialist Marxist ideas brought in, and now we should do a fundamental revision. And this whole idea that this revision means saffronization should be challenged not in political terms. It should be challenged purely in terms of the textual knowledge. The Jnana Rashi, the Shastras, the texts of our tradition. Now, civilizations live by their own texts. Which is the civilization in this world which has lived without the texts? And it is texts which create a revolution. When Christianity came into the Mediterranean world and started expanding, it threw out a large number of older texts. It demonized so many things. You know, it was the Christians who virtually killed Greek theatre. No scholar of Western classics talks about it, except a few who know the history of how Jerome and Augustine and various other theologians said that doing a dramatic act is abetting the work of the devil, because God has created you, a person, in His image. He has given me this image. God has given me this. It is His image. Now, if I give up this image and take up another person's image, then I am doing what the devil does. Therefore, theatre is bad, and one should not go to theatre, one should not perform theatre. And the great tradition of theatre in the Greek world and the world around it died out. It was a value which they imposed, that I will not give up my image, and hence I will not do an action of this kind. And then we had so many things like iconoclasm and breaking of the idols and putting away the ancient Greek religion and demonizing every aspect of it, establishment of Christianity. And it is then in the 15th, 16th century that a change takes place in Europe, which they very proudly and rightly call the Renaissance. And the Renaissance comes in how? With the reintroduction of the Greek texts, with the reintroduction of so many Greek and Roman concepts of aesthetics, with making the human body once again worth paying attention to. The body, the soma, becomes important. You start showing it in paintings, you look for beauty in it. And you even develop the natural sciences, and you pay attention to the physical world to develop a whole new culture and a whole new philosophy. So modern European culture underwent a great change through revival of texts. Because they did not have their own texts, they took texts from Greeks and Romans, and they made a discourse that we are inheriting the Greeks and the Romans, and this and the Greeks and the Romans and ourselves, we constitute the so-called Western civilization, right? That is the West. They made a whole new discourse. They dominated the world. It was good for them. Of course, it was very bad for us, but it was a new civilization. The texts are the basis of the civilization. When they come to India, when they take hold of the education system, then as you all know, and we needn't repeat it, they put away our texts. And now the task is very simple. you have to start from 1832 again. If Macaulay removed your own texts, you bring them back. Is it impossible? Is it wrong? Of course, many people would say it is obscurantism, it is revival, but I fail to understand if reviving Aristotle and Plato and Thales and all those ancient Greek texts was not revivalism, but like an elixir in 16th century Europe, then how can reviving Indian texts be sinful or obscurantist in 21st century? And we are not borrowing, we are just bringing into the forefront our own text. It seems to me that our whole idea of what is good in textual knowledge suffers from 4 basic faults. The first, as I just talked about, is Shastropeksha. You discard your text, your Shastra. Shastropeksha. Another great pastime for us in India is Varna Garhana. That is castigating the caste or the Varna system. Independent India recreated the worst kind of caste system in a new kind of politician who have supreme power. Not even the ancient monarchs had so much power and wealth as our modern politicians have. We created a bureaucracy which has immense power and influence, which the ancient Kayasthas never had in the Arthashastra. So we created a caste system. We created and reaffirmed a new social order, and yet we go on castigating the old caste system. You see the hypocrisy of modern India. And all this was done in the name of democracy, equality, and socialism. So Varna Garhana is the second, Shastropeksha, Varna Garhana, and Paramartha Vaimukhyata. That is, whatever is the ultimate aim of life or the deeper aim of life, you should go away from it. Don't think of it. Don't think of the sublime things. Just think of worldly things. Just think of success. Don't think of cooperation. Think of competition. You teach your child to be the first in class, not to help anybody else in class. And you make a competitive society. Jo jeeta so Sikandar, as the popular film says, the one who wins is Alexander. So, we created this competitive society for material gains which would totally look away from the higher aim, Paramartha Vaimukhyata. In traditional Indian order, Paramartha was not always just moksha or vairagya. It was supreme dedication to something, selfless dedication. So I have seen dancers, musicians, scholars, social workers totally dedicated to their work, selfless dedication, and that is Paramartha. That was not necessarily giving up the life of the grihastha or the householder and retiring into the forest. And other than these three, Shastropeksha, Varna Garhana, Paramartha Vaimukhyata, there is the modern arrogance that ours is the best age. Sampradaya Pramada. We are the most evolved in this modern world. All other ancient civilizations were somewhere or the other lacking. Their values were not so good. We are, according to the Darwinian pattern, at the helm of things. We are at top of history. So these four things, as you can understand, were perhaps never entertained by any serious civilization. I don't know the Egyptian and the Chinese civilization. I have not read their texts, but I have read some Greek and Roman texts. I have read Indian texts, and there was no place, there was no possibility of entertaining any of these four ideas. They could never discard the text that had been written by their ancestors. There could be no Shastropeksha among the Greeks or the Indians. There could be no total disregard of social hierarchy. There could be no confusion between equality and equanimity. You see, today what we do, we want to make everything equal without placing it in a proper order. So in the name of equality, we try to give the same rights, the same lifestyle, the same same privilege to just about everybody, whether the person is capable of performing any social function through that or not. This kind of thinking was impossible in other cultures. They would not have. And then all the valuable cultures of the past, they never thought that they were on the top of the world. Very often they thought that things were declining, that they were not in the golden age, that they were in an iron age or in an age worse. Like we thought that we are in Kali Yuga, and the Greeks thought that they were living in the iron age. So what is required in terms of value education is, first of all, a rethink at least about these four things. Now suppose if my hypothesis is accepted, tatah kim, then what? How are we going about in trying to bring a change and to bring the text again into education, into learning, into the system, and then into application in the modern world? You see, it's one thing to believe in the value of your ancient text, ancient, medieval, and not so modern, all the texts that have been produced in India in last 5,000 years. Yes, how do you go about it, and what will you do? And this, of course, is presuming that the debate and the battle about saffronization would be put aside, and that there would be a consensus that Indian texts in all languages, not essentially necessarily just in Sanskrit, but in all languages, somewhere or the other, are revived. Suppose if we agree upon that, then how would we go about it? What would be the system? What would be the practical method of actually doing it? You see, this is a very important thing. Can we use these texts once again? Is it possible to use them? Along with this comes up the question, can you do it without the knowledge of our Indian languages? Not just Sanskrit, but all Indian languages, all modern Indian languages, not just Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, Prakrits, then the Abhranshas, then the medieval Indian languages, and the modern Indian. The texts are in all of them. And if you do not have any direct contact with these languages anymore, if these languages as a whole are out of the education system, then how would you bring in these texts? How would people read, get to know, discuss? So the first thing is to look afresh at our languages. And this has to be done to see them as something which is utilitarian. You see, we have associated Sanskrit in particular with religion. One of the most unfortunate things that happened after, not in British time, but after independence in the Nehruvian area, was association of Indian arts and Indian Vidyas with Hinduism. This has been the great contribution of socialism to Indian intellectual growth, that it put aside whole heritage as bourgeois, as backward, as something which need not be now paid attention to. So how would you then look upon Sanskrit? And you know, Sanskrit is now very often called a dead language. Last week I was reading that in England they are going to create a new edition of Shakespeare. Because not only in schools but even in colleges, they don't understand Shakespeare at all. The English, 400-year-old English is too much for them. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. In sooth, nobody in England understands in sooth or thou shalt. So they said, now let's remove all this from Shakespeare, bring it into modern English. I'm serious. It's serious news, and the academics are considering it. They say otherwise we lose Shakespeare. Shakespeare would become to us like Chaucer. Nobody reads Chaucer, very few, or Mallory, or any of those 11th century English texts. But in my dead language called Sanskrit, with a little bit of training, I can read Shri Sukta and Agnimide Purohitam. I can read the Vedic Samhitas. I can read Kalidas. Before that, I can read so many other texts, the Upanishads, etc., etc. This dead language provides me 7,000 years of literature. Right from Rig Veda to, let us say, something which a modern Sanskrit poet may have written. I may need just a little training to read some things in the Vedic Sanskrit. But other than that, the dead language provides me everything. So which language is dead, sir? Can you call it a dead language? We don't understand that this was done deliberately, under an inspiration. That's why it is Devvani. Because it has a touch of, or it is Amrita. And the unfortunate thing is that the Amritavani is called a Mritavani, or a dead language. We have not looked upon these things purely in linguistic terms. We have only looked upon this as certain linguistic theories propounded by linguists who do not belong to our tradition, but to an outside tradition. So if we look upon the utility of our texts of all kinds from a very different way. Now, most people think that Indian texts are religious. That's a misinformation which has been disseminated. Most Indian texts are not religious. Only the texts which relate to Brahma Vidya, they are so-called spiritual or religious texts. All other texts which relate to daily life or which relate to certain disciplines and arts, they are absolutely secular. Like a book on medicine or on modern physics. And all these texts, because they tell us about how to go about a systematic study of something, are called Shastras. So for all the disciplines and all the technical, scientific areas of knowledge, we had our texts. Have they all become outdated? Are they all useless? Is there nothing in them which can be used? And if they have to be used, then we have to know, first of all, the language in which, or the languages in which they are written. You see, part of the Nehruvian system was to create a disability to read languages in our schools and particularly colleges. Even a small American or British university, if you go for a Ph.D, would want you to read the texts of your area in that language. At least the good ones would want that. You should have a working knowledge. So if somebody is doing, let's say, a Ph.D. On Sophocles or Socrates, then he must know classical Greek up to a degree. Otherwise, a good university would not give her or him a degree. But do you know, in India, at the most prestigious university, if you are doing a Ph.D., let us say in ancient Indian history, you need not know Sanskrit. You need not know Prakrit. You are doing a Ph.D. in Buddhism, you need not know Ardha Magadhi or Pali. You just can read translation into English. So a distaste for language, a misuse of, and then a de-emphasizing of languages. The great emphasis has been, how many languages will a child read? You see, how many languages? It's such a burden. Now, India has always been a multilingual society. Maybe all of you don't know, or most of you don't know, that it was not only for practical purposes, but even for entertainment, that Indians cultivated many languages. Indian theatre, ancient Indian theatre, was not Sanskrit theatre. It was a multilingual theatre. Professors of Sanskrit today do not know this. When I go to Sanskrit departments and tell them that a so-called Sanskrit drama was only 20% in Sanskrit and 80% was Magadhi or Avantika or Saurashtri or any other Prakrit and other Prakrits, then they are struck with disbelief. They don't accept what I say. Because all the Pandits say, Acha, it was not in Sanskrit. And I have to show them an original text printed from Nirnay Sagar or something 100 years ago that okay, Dushyanta speaks in Sanskrit, but Shakuntala speaks in Avantika. She speaks in Prakrit. So it was a multilingual theatre. And all the musical songs were not in Sanskrit. Nothing was sung in Sanskrit. It was sung in different Prakrits. This was our theatre. We were multilingual people. We never identified ourselves as Tamilian or Marathi or Hindi wala and things like that. That did not go into the making of our identity. We were multilingual. We learned so many languages. We used all these languages. We created in these languages. And so to say that how many languages will a child read in school, it be burdened, is really going against the very current of education. So the first thing is to have a cultivation of a larger number of languages. People are already overburdened by 3-language formula. They want to reduce it to 2-language formula. In practice into 1-language formula, which is just read English. And if you want to open a primary school, then you name the school Little Angels. You see, giving the message that only English will be taught here, and day after day you read this news that a teacher beat up a little child because he or she was not speaking in English. This is only Anglophonic hegemony. It has to be shed in India. There is no other way. If you shed the Anglophonic hegemony of the bureaucratic class, then there shall be space for Indian languages, all Indian languages, including Sanskrit and Tamil and classical Tamil and other things. Having said this, how would you bring these texts into education? I would never suggest that we just start teaching the young children, asking them to mug up the name of the great books of India and things like that. You see, if you want a child to be acquainted with the classical, the ancient, the historical traditions and values of India, then the only way of introducing these things to a child is through arts. After all, why were the arts so important? 64 colors were prescribed in Kama Shastras. For good living, to be a good citizen, a woman or a man should know some out of the 64 arts. Because arts brought communication, arts brought culture. The diversity created was a happy diversity, something full of interest. And I think that is where one should begin with. Today the arts, as I said in my last lecture, are out of the formal training system. All the arts, some schools can teach some arts, some others can teach some other arts. There are hundreds of modern and medieval and ancient methods, artistic genres, which can be taught, revived according to the region, the area, the languages in which you live. It is not that a central prescription is to be given from NCERT Delhi. I had proposed, much to the discomfort of the central government, that UGC and NCERT should be disbanded. There is no need for these institutions. The states can take care of the diversity. And you can have central exams to do certain central things, and people will manage. There is no need for Delhi to prescribe culture to everybody. Of course, such ideas are never taken kindly by any government. But I still believe that it is the region which creates the diversity of education. And great art and artists have come to the capital from regions in India. Tansen was not born in Agra. He was not nurtured at the court of Akbar the Great. He was nurtured in Madhya Pradesh and Rewa. And it was only towards the end of his life, when he had attained all India fame, that Akbar called for him and he went and adorned the Mughal court at Agra. And there are innumerable examples of great artists being called or being patronized by the central emperor. That was one of the systems, but they were created in regions. So if we take care of reviving at the local level through arts up to, let us say, 7th and 8th, the whole heritage, where it is done through painting, it is done through just sheer practice of different genres, you imbibe the value. You see, you will imbibe the value of what is in Kalidas by doing one single act of Kalidas play. Small children can do it. A little more grown-up children can do it. It is better education. It is better skill in communication. Today we are so worried about teaching communication skills, media method, when we already have these old systems which work marvelously. I have seen how theatre and painting and music bring transformation in children, in middle-aged people, even in old-age people. They really transform them. And one of the reasons why Indian society, to my mind, was very healthy till recent times, in pre-modern times, was because there was a greater practice of the art. There may not have been great artists in every house or every home, but there were small practicing artists in every home, nearly every home, some kind of the other. It is at the class 8th, 9th and 10th that you have to formally introduce what were the ancient texts, what were the texts of various disciplines. And then at college, you have to enter into them seriously. Now that's where the big task is. You know, the Sanskrit department are very lonely departments. They are cut off from all other systems of knowledge. The Sanskrit departments teach Sanskrit just as the English departments in India teach English. Most of the Sanskrit departments do not teach Arthashastra. They mention, but they never teach. They do not teach Ayurveda. They mention. But there is nobody who has done a Ph.D. in Charak from a standard Sanskrit department. So these are the Sanskrit departments which can go through all these are ancient texts, but they have no knowledge of the knowledge system or the discipline in those texts. The Indian Shastras were not written to compose something in Sanskrit. They were practical. They were Prayoga Shastras. They were prayoga vijnana. They were meant to be used. They were not just theoretical concepts. They were to be applied. And therefore, they were to be taught where that particular vidya or discipline was being practiced and put to use. So, if you want to understand a Shilpa Shastri like Manasar, then it's only a practicing architect, a Vastu Shastra practitioner, a maker of temples or wells or somebody in the traditional system who can tell you what this text means. For instance, there is a term called hasta. Now, what does hasta mean? My hand, your hand, or baby's hand? And the Shastri will tell you, no, this is a hasta. We have been using it and practicing it when we make a temple. If it says that this portion is going to be 20 hastas, we know how big, how long or how wide it would be. So these were practical things. In other words, the place of Artha Shastra is not in the Sanskrit department, but in the department of economics. It is the department of economics which has to study the Artha Shastra. But of course, the department of economics will have to cooperate with the department of Sanskrit so that they can read the text in original. If they seriously want, there should be somebody in that department who knows Sanskrit. You see, when people want to propagate Sanskrit, and all our debate in past 50, 60 years have been only just in teaching it as a language, they forget that that is the worst way of teaching it, because that is teaching it without a purpose. So, if people have to learn it in Department of Economics, some people, somebody who is specializing there, not everybody. If somebody has to learn it in mathematics to read Leelavati, if somebody has to do it in modern medicine or Department of Ayurveda, then that is how the use of Sanskrit language would be put to a practical use. So, my proposal has been that a revival of Indian classical texts as practical texts in modern times is the way to revitalize ancient knowledge systems. This of course means that you would have to put aside many things which would not be understood or which would not be relevant or which would not be useful today, but there would be many things which would certainly be useful, particularly in the law books, for instance. It will resolve so many of our problems. For instance, I give you one example. Today there is a big debate about so-called love marriage. It's considered to be very modern. But we had Gandharva Vivaha, and according to Manu, Gandharva Vivaha did not require any witnesses. If a man and woman say that, okay, we are going to be married, and if the woman says, okay, I wed you as my husband, and they sexually unite and they start living as a husband and wife, it is a legal marriage. And if they go and tell their elders, we are married, we did a Gandharva Vivaha on our own somewhere, then they cannot be persecuted. Today they will be persecuted. The British law, which we inherit, asks many questions. So maybe there is something we can take from the spirit of Manu, the Gandharva Vivaha, and make our present day laws more liberal and acceptable to the young lovers. If you read Dharma Shastras in the context of Gotra, then you will understand that this whole idea which the Jats promote, that the whole village is a Gotra, is false. You know, the Jats kill their children if they marry from the same village. They say this is not permissible because this is Sagotra Vivaha. All these things are prevailing because of an absolute lack of knowledge about the classical texts. And the classical texts prescribe a very small prayashchit, even if you do a Sagotra Vivaha, 1 month of fasting. So the so-called evil Brahmin Manu prescribes 1 month of prayashchit if you have done a Sagotra Vivaha. But the modern Jat Khap prescribes death. Look at the disjunct that has happened by not knowing ourselves. My submission is that this task should be taken seriously, and it should be taken with faith or Shraddha. Not blind faith, not aggressively insistent faith, but with an open-minded inquiry as to how can these texts be very useful. And once these texts are studied, especially in the field of morality, in the field of achar and vichar, in the field of dharma as Dharma Shastra, you would find them that they prescribed ways of life which were far more tolerant than our present day laws. They were really far more tolerant. And I am not taking here the approach that so many of us normally take, that we take a line from here and say, okay, yatra narya pujante ramante tatra devata, this is what Manu said, and so we should, honor women. I am not taking this approach of picking up a line from here and there and talking about it. I am talking about looking upon the whole system, critiquing it and using it for the present needs. To see their vision, to see their understanding. The same thing happens to many other texts. Of course, there would be some texts of technology which may not be useful today because modern technology has superseded that kind of earlier technology. But there are many fields perhaps which may still surprise us. Other than Dharma Shastras, the whole Shastras about performance, about social relationships, texts about legal division of property, they can all be very useful. The whole concept of the individual, which has become a serious problem for us today, it's a concept imported from modern Europe, that property belongs to an individual, that self-earned property, I can will it to anybody I like. I can disinherit anybody I like. It's based upon the concept of individualism, which does not exist in any of the old smritis. And if you appreciate their vision, then they provide us a vision of a better life. So my submission is that value education in itself, by just searching for certain maxims of good things extracted from our tradition, will not work. It is the texts of the tradition, texts as whole, which need to be revived, and that would provide us the real value and the total value by which our ancestors lived and which they can pass on to us very usefully. Thank you very much.